So in this video then, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the organization of skeletal muscle. So figure 10.1 is an excellent resource here. I'm going to kind of go backwards to the order that your textbook uses. In my mind, it makes a little more sense, and maybe for you it's just like a second way to look at this organization. All right, so I'm going to start at the very smallest part of a muscle, which is the muscle fiber. Sometimes you'll see that called a myofiber, right? That prefix myo means muscle. So muscle cell or muscle fiber, right? And there they're saying it's the cell. Now, this cell is going to be covered in a connective tissue layer called the endomysium. Right? We'll write that a little bigger for you. Endomysium, right? So that is just this connective tissue wrapper that's covering each individual cell. A couple things to note on that kind of helps hold adjacent myosatellite cells, which are essentially stem cells, close to each muscle cell. Here they're trying to show neurons and capillaries also being held in close proximity to that cell. So the endomysium is important for that. Now, each individual muscle cell is then bundled together into what we call a muscle fascicle, right? Just a little bundle. If you've eaten meat, you have seen, probably noticed these fascicles before, right? It's just a bundle of muscle cells or muscle fibers. It is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the perimysium. And same idea, this connective tissue is maybe a little bit tougher, a little bit more collagen, but again, we're holding blood vessels and nerves around this fascicle. Fascicles are then grouped together into what we would actually call a muscle, right? That actual skeletal muscle that has a name that you'll be learning in lab, which is the contents of chapter 11, if you haven't picked up on that, right? And the skeletal muscle as a whole is surrounded in a connective tissue layer called the epimysium. Epimysium. Right? Again, holding all the fascicles together, but also carrying blood vessels and nerves to this entire organ. Now, what happens is these three connective tissue layers at the end of the muscle, they're all going to fuse together, and that connective tissue then is called a tendon, or another form is an aponeurosis. When that connective tissue, instead of being like a bundle, like a tendon is, it's maybe more of a flat band. We'll see that in some muscles. That flat band is called an aponeurosis. But what this does is it means that the connective tissues that make up tendons are actually very intricately layered into all of your skeletal muscles, and you can get this extremely strong attachment then to skeletal muscles, where the collagen fibers of that connective tissue actually then fuse into the collagen fibers that make up bone. In lab, you will be learning the names of those individual muscles. You'll also be focusing some on what we call the origin and the insertion of a muscle. And this is descriptive of where on the bone muscle actually attaches. And the way these terms, right, so you have two different ends of a muscle. The way these terms are used then is the origin is the fixed end of the muscle, and the insertion is the more mobile end. Now this gets a little tricky, but for the most part, you can think through this, right? If I was going to do a bicep curl, the origin on the biceps is up here on the humerus and the scapula, and the insertion is actually down on the radius, right? It crosses the elbow, and that's why contraction helps you to flex your elbow, right? So origin and insertion will be coming your way as well. Okay, so then let's go even smaller And let's look at what's going on inside of a muscle cell. Now this muscle cell or muscle fiber, and I keep trying to use both those terms. Your book really seems to like to use muscle fiber or myofiber, and we'll see that there's some other words that are pretty similar in this chapter. So just kind of keep practice using that in the correct form. Now, skeletal muscle cells have some unique features. For one, they're actually huge, right? Some of them are huge. So some of the muscle cells in places like your quadriceps, the big muscle on the front of your thigh, right, can be up to like 12 inches, a foot long. That's a really big cell. The other one thing that becomes really obvious, right, is this muscle fiber, this muscle cell is multinucleate. And we talked about that when we were in tissues, but let's look at why, right? So when muscle fibers are forming, right, during development, what happens is you have these myoblasts, right, these stem cells that are dividing and then fusing together. And so a muscle fiber is actually a fusion of many, many, many cells, right, these myoblasts. Some of those stem cells stay behind in close association with our mature cells, and those are called myosatellite cells. Those can act as stem cells and actually aid in repair. Now, we talked in tissues that skeletal muscle is not very good at regeneration, right? It typically does fibrosis, scarring, but that's really when we're talking about something like a big injury, right? A torn hamstring, quite likely to come back as scar tissue. But anytime you're doing activity, if you're in lifting weights or you're skiing really hard and you feel that burn and things afterwards, right, you've actually damaged skeletal muscle cells. These myosatellite cells can divide and then actually fuse with the skeletal muscle cell and help it repair itself. So on the small end, those micro tears, skeletal muscle is actually quite good at repairing itself. Okay, now having all these cells fuse together lets us make a really long cell, which can be useful. But the other thing that it does for us is it gives us lots of nuclei in a single cell. Now think about why that could be useful. If you were thinking along the lines of DNA being in the nucleus, you're correct, right? And there's all these instructions in there. And so when the skeletal muscle needs to produce either the proteins that make up these fibrils inside of the cell, or, right, like actin and myosin, we'll go there, or to produce lots of enzymes for the reactions that are going to take place, those enzymes are protein. And so we need to crank out lots of protein. The more copies of messenger RNA that we have access to, the more quickly we're able to make those changes. And so what we see is that all the nuclei in a cell can start cranking out those copies of the instructions, and we can be much more efficient at producing proteins, right? So we end up with this multinucleate cell. Okay, now I'm gonna switch to the next one. I wanna go through a little bit of the terminology of the cell components because this is super annoying in this chapter. They've basically just changed the name of all the cell parts that you learned in Gen Bio. So check this out. Okay, so just to kind of orient us, and this is where I said a lot of these words start to sound the same, right? Remember the name of the muscle cell is a myofiber. And inside, so this is a single cell, we've just zoomed in here, there are all these little bundles of actin and myosin. The bundle is called the myofibril, not confusing at all. The myofibril is made up of the myofilaments, actin and myosin. The thin filament is actin, the thick filament is myosin, right? So they get bundled together into a myofibril. A bunch of those myofibrils are filling in the myofiber. Okay, it becomes more fun. When we start to look at some of these structures, right, the cell membrane gets a new name. It is now called the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is just another name for the cell membrane. The sarcoplasm any guesses? It's the cytoplasm. I might be off the board here, right? Again, sarcoplasm you might at least recognize. Okay, we have structures in skeletal muscle called T-tubules. T-tubules are transverse tubules. This does not have an equivalent in other cells, but notice what happens here. Along the sarcolemma, you actually see these little pores. The T-tubules are shown here in yellow, and the T-tubule is just an extension of the sarcolemma diving through the cell, going all the way across it. I like this picture here. You can see how it makes kind of this web, this network as it cuts across the cell, right? Again, these T-tubules are extensions of the sarcolemma. Now, one of the things we'll look at, the sarcolemma is actually capable of carrying and propagating an electrical charge, and that is also then going to be true of the T-tubules and is going to help us carry these electrical messages deep down within the cell. Okay, this blue artist rendition, this blue kind of mesh covering over each myofibril is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR. That one might sound familiar. Okay, it's the equivalent of the endoplasmic reticulum, right, which we saw making lipids or modifying proteins in other cells. Here in the muscle cell, its main function is going to be to store and release calcium. Calcium is going to be integral to the contraction process, as we'll see here in a bit. Right, so you have these big sacs of calcium, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, covering the myofibril. Now you might notice on each end, it actually gets a little thicker, a little more kind of bulbous, right? And we call that the terminal cisternae, right? So that is part of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, terminal, right? Meaning on the ends of the SR, and cisternae. Have you heard of a cistern before? It's just a big, often underground, not always, a big container for water, a cistern, right? So this is a kind of an enlargement here that's storing even more calcium. Now, you might notice that those terminal cisternae are butted right up against that T-tubule, and this is an important anatomical, functional relationship. In fact, it's so important that they've given this a little nickname, a triad. A triad, right, think three, it's this terminal cisternae, a T-tubule, and this terminal cisternae. So a triad is two terminal cisternae and one T-tubule. And as that electrical message is able to come down into the cell through the terminal cisternae, it's actually going to trigger the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, I know this is a ton of terminology, but it's not going to, the actual contraction of muscle won't make any sense unless you're a little bit practiced in this particular terminology. Now, other things that they're not showing on here that are important in skeletal muscle, things like skeletal muscle has a special protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin acts very similarly to hemoglobin in that it can reversibly bind to oxygen, right? So the muscle cells are able to grab oxygen out of the bloodstream and basically store it on myoglobin to then use. Muscle cells also have a very rich supply of glycogen, which, if you think back to our macromolecules, is the way that animals are able to store carbohydrates in the form of energy, right? It's a bunch of glucose molecules put together. So the myoglobin is storing the oxygen, the glycogen is storing the glucose, right, or the fuel. And so these cells are basically keeping their own supplies to run cellular respiration. Last thing I'll point out here are the mitochondria. They are no different than any other cells, but they are very abundant, right? This is a very metabolically active tissue. And keep in mind, mitochondria are able to divide, right? Multiply. And so this is part of training, right? Is actually increasing, right? If you're an endurance athlete, maybe a runner, you're actually, as you stress the muscle, that you're actually increasing the number of mitochondria that are inside and able to supply energy to the cells. You also can increase the number of capillaries inside of a muscle in order to deliver more oxygen.